So what this talk is about, basically, is a bit of our journey, how we came from 3 to 4, which was a bumpy ride, which I'll get in more detail about that. Like, you know, what we learned, what feedback we got from people, and what things we changed and why we changed them, and also kind of like an interesting story about how the platform has improved. Yeah, like going from Katana to ASP.NET Core, we were actually really happy we could delete a lot of code in our code base, because suddenly all the things, or many things that we had to reinvent ourselves on Katana because they weren't built in, are now built into ASP.NET Core, and we really like ASP.NET Core as a platform to build HTTP applications on. So how many are using ASP.NET Core in this room? Okay. Excellent. So let's get started, I guess. So the first thing that's new, I should point it out, is we finally have a website, right? So we never had that before. And you know, you get like the high-level information from here. We have a new documentation. It's using Read the Docs, which is pretty nice. So if you're looking into building your own documentation for open source projects, that's a nice project to support. We have officially training now, so we've been doing that on the side for many years, but now we basically have now a training schedule. I just did a training yesterday, full day training here at Techorama. So if you're interested in that, there are like, you know, 1 day, 2 day versions of that. And what many people have asked us about in the last couple of years is, you know, like the Microsoft ecosystem, like transitioning to open source, you know, and companies that never did open source before, they are like a little, they have like open questions, yeah, like is it secure because you can see the source code, right? Or what happens if you know something happens? Can you provide support? And obviously, Brock and me, being a two-man company working on all these projects, we can't provide, you know, like support, like real production support. So we have solved that problem now. So we have 2 companies one in Europe and one in the States that can now actually do SLA-based support for IdentityServer. So that was a bit of work to set that up. What else is new? We also, that's another thing that many people have asked us about. Can't you provide like a graphical user interface to configure Identity Server and all that? And we now have that as well. When you go to IdentityServer4.com, there's now an admin UI. So that's just, you know, that was the marketing part. What else is new and important is, you know, OpenID Connect. You can certify your OpenID Connect implementation, and that is done with the OpenID Foundation. And we had that for IdentityServer3 in 2015 already, and at the end of last year we also went through the certification for IdentityServer4. So it's now fully certified for, you know, the basic, the implicit, the hybrid, and the config profile. So that's also good news. So it's fully spec compliant. The other thing that's new actually on the OpenID Foundation website is now you can also certify client libraries. Yeah, so like on one hand you have the server, on the other hand you have the client. And you know, the assumption is that when you have a client that has support or is certified for the basic profile, it will work with any OpenID provider that has support or certified for the same profile. And both Brock certified his JavaScript library, and I certified my library for native clients. Yeah, like it's a .NET Standard library which works on, you know, desktop.NET and Xamarin and the Mac and Linux and so on. So if you are building clients, that might be something interesting to you. Okay. So the story behind IdentityServer4 is that, you know, pretty soon after we've done with IdentityServer3, yeah, Brock and I said, yeah, that's the last time we're going to rewrite this, yeah, and you know, an email came in from a guy from the Microsoft from the ASP.NET team and said, you know what? There's this new thing, ASP.NET Core, and it's basically it's a new project, and you won't be able to run your Katana-based middleware anymore in ASP.NET Core, or at least not in a way that it would work for you guys. So he also said, while transitioning from Katana to ASP.NET Core, they're gonna get rid of all of the middlewares they had to issue tokens, right? They had in Katana they had an OAuth authorization server middleware that was issuing OAuth tokens, and so they said, yeah, we gonna stop doing that because we want to focus on the consuming side of the story, right? Like consuming tokens from MVC, consuming tokens from APIs, and so on. So they said, like, you know what? Would you mind, or would you be willing to fill that gap? They're like, yeah, like write something that issues tokens for ASP.NET Core. And I was young. I needed the money, right? So I said, yeah, sure, why not? Yeah. And then, and then the rest is history, kind of. Yeah, like ASP.NET Core or .NET Core itself was kind of changing on a daily basis, yeah, and we had to try to keep up, and always when they had a beta version or whatever they called it, I mean, these names don't matter anymore, right? We had to release something as well that works with the current version, and I'm sure other people in this room went through the same transitioning phase where they tried to keep up with Microsoft changing the platform all the time, and you're trying to build something that works on it. So it was an interesting ride, and at the end we are actually quite happy with how it turned out. So what I want to do basically is walk you through a scenario that is actually pretty common these days, where people have IdentityServer4, but they started to build applications and APIs using the new ASP.NET Core, right? And then at some point, they also maybe want to get rid of their Katana-based identity server and want to switch to the ASP.NET Core-based identity server. So basically, what I have here is a Katana-based identity server. I have an MVC application here. I have an API and a console client, which represents like a server-to-server style communication. So what I want to do is basically, I want to build an IdentityServer4 from scratch, migrate the configuration, and leave the applications untouched, yeah, and just see what has changed and maybe also why things have changed. So how many did Katana in this room? Okay, a couple of people. So the way this works in Katana is basically, you have the choice between IIS hosting and self-hosting, and you have this thing called a web app, which is really like, a little web server that you start, and it listens on some port, and then you pass in this thing called startup. Oh yeah, and another good point is what you typically do very early in the process is you set up your logging. So Katana had kind of limited logging capabilities built in, so we had to invent our own. So we used a library called liblog from a guy called Damien Hickey, and the idea was of this liblog library is to give you an abstraction over logging, right? Because we need more abstractions over logging. But the idea was pretty clever, because basically as a library developer, you didn't want to buy into a specific logging framework. Yeah? You just wanted to have logging inside your code, but don't mandate that the people that use the library have nlog or log4net or serilog or whatever. So Damien built this pretty clever thing. Basically, what it does is when you log to that liblog library, he pokes around in the app domain and sees, like, does the host use nlog? Then use this. Does the host use serilog? Then use that. So basically, dynamically, based on reflection, he figures out what's the preferred logging framework of the host that is using the library, and then it just picks that up. And in this case, we were using serilog, yeah, which is my favorite logging library, and just by virtue of setting up serilog in our app domain, logging got picked up. And we got many people asking us, like, how do I set up logging? Like, I don't find anything in IdentityServer that allows me to connect IdentityServer to nlog, whatever, right? And the answer is, yeah, it's magic, right? I mean, you don't have to set it up at all. You just, use your logger, we will use it. So, the good news with ASP.NET Core is now that they have a pretty nice built-in logging infrastructure, and also all of the big logging frameworks now these days have adapters to use ASP.NET Core, so this is not necessary anymore. The magic is not necessary anymore, at least. Yeah. What else was in Katana, which was interesting? So in Katana, there was, they had this concept of middleware, right? The HP pipeline, and basically you set up your middleware in that pipeline. In that case, IdentityServer, and the style was pretty much that you had this thing called the options object. Yeah. So basically, all of your configuration for that middleware you put onto a freaking big options class, and then you pass that into the middleware. Now, what Katana didn't have, for example, is dependency injection, right? So, which is something that we actually needed, yeah? So we had to build our own, well, not our own, but we took whatever was our favorite dependency injection framework at the time, which was AutoFag, and basically wrapped that in our own thing called the IdentityServer Service Factory, yeah? So basically what you're doing here basically is really, with all these extension methods, you are configuring a DI container, and then you pass that into our middleware, and then internally we had to set up our own AutoFag integration for Katana. So we, if we could have gotten around all of that, we would have, right? But it didn't exist by the time. So the next thing is the UI, So when I run this guy, actually, and go to, where it lives, you see there is actually a UI here, yeah? Where does that come from? There's no HTML files, no whatever files, no CSHTML, no controllers, nothing. That was the next limitation we had to work around at Katana time, was that there was no UI framework that was independent of IIS. Right? So we had customers saying, we want to run the token service as an NT service, not inside of IIS. So how do you do UI then, if there's no UI framework? MVC had a hard dependency on Katana, on IIS. So guess what we did? We wrote our own, right? So we wrote our own view engine, yeah, and we first thought, okay, maybe we can do that, yeah. And then we realized, oh, we need anti-forgery tokens. So we implemented that, yeah, and it was like a whole, other things that came after that, and also customizing the UI was not as straightforward as we wanted to, but it was the only, solution by the time, So let's actually run that. So here's an API. This API is an ASP.NET Core API. So basically, you see that it's set up to consume tokens from this authority here. So let's run this guy. And what is the actual controller doing? Not a lot, right? It's protected, and it just echoes back whatever claims we find on the user object here. And then we have a console client. Again, this represents like a server-to-server style communication with no human involved. And what does this client need to know? He needs to know where is the token service, what's my client ID, what's my client secret, to which API do I want to talk, and where does this API live, right? And then you can get the discovery document from the OpenID Connect provider, which is this JSON document here that has all the metadata about the token service. Yeah. And then you open a token client, pass in the token endpoint, pass in the client ID, the secret, and request an access token. Yeah. And when we have the access token and that's all successful, we create an HTTP client, put the access token on the authorization header, and then call the API. Okay, so in other words, if I run that, it first gets token, and then it it calls the API, and the API is just returning the claims. You see there's an issuer claim here, there's an expiration claim, and the client ID claim. Okay? So that's our server-to-server style communication. The other client we have here is an MVC client. Again, it's MVC core, yeah, and that's the OpenID Connect middleware that ships with ASP.NET Core. And again, same idea. You tell MVC where is the token service. You could configure the client ID, the client secret, which the response type, to which resources do you want to have access to. Yeah, and that's it, pretty much, yeah. And when you run that, and you hit a controller that is protected with the authorized attribute, for example, then they automatically redirect you to the configured token service. And you are at the login screen, and that is an example of our built-in view engine, rendering that login screen. Now, typically, the token service can now decide which way to go. Do I want to provide local accounts? Do I want to provide external logins like Google or business partner logins, whatever, or both? Yeah. So let's log in with Bob. And we are back at the application. The OpenID Connect middleware did its magic. The user is signed in, right? So we asked for a couple of things here, like his user ID, and his name, and his email address, and his location, and the rest is authentication metadata, like the time of the authentication time, the authentication method, and so on. So, and then we can call an API because we asked for access to the API resource, so the token service returned an access token, and now we can call the API from the MVC client, and this echoes back the claims that we just seen, and you've seen that in the user scenario, you get back more claims than just for a machine. The machine only had the client ID. Here you also have things like, again, like the subject ID and the authentication time and these things. Okay, so that's kind of like the scenario, pretty common these days. Server-to-server communication and an interactive UI that authenticates users and then delegates the identity of the user to a different server. So now, let's migrate the whole thing to IdentityServer and see how that looks like. So the first thing, there are a couple of ways to start here now. One could be you're just opening, creating a new MVC application, a new ASP.NET Core application, empty, for example, and then start from scratch. The other option you have is you use one of these templates from Microsoft, like the MVC template with individual accounts, so you get like the login screen already and the register page and all that, and then just add our middleware to that. Or we have some templates for that as well now. So you might have heard that with the new SDK in .NET, you can now provide templates. So we have a repo here, which has 3 templates in it. One is like just the bare bones IdentityServer4 project. One is just the UI bits. Yeah, that's something I'm going to show you in detail later. We have separated the UI from the core server, so to speak. Now, because now we have actually a UI framework which is not tied to IIS anymore, and we have like an all-in-one template that has sets up everything with sample clients and sample resources and sample users and all these things. Yeah? And the way you install these templates is you go to the command line and you say .NET new -i for install, and then that is the name of the NuGet package that holds these template files. So that's a new thing, yeah, in the new .NET Core, .NET SDK, I should say. And pretty obvious, right? : star means install the latest version. Yeah. So I did that already. The other thing actually that was demoed at Build, when you now produce these templates, and anybody can do that, right? You can write your own template. It's actually pretty easy. You just provide a little bit more metadata, and then you can go into the new file new dialog in Visual Studio as well. Okay, so also for your company maybe or internally, if you want to have some typical starter code, you can wrap it up in a template and then install it into the new file new dialog in Visual Studio, which is not the current version of Visual, but the one they previewed at build, so that one that ships anytime soon. Okay, so let's actually use this template. Let's go here. Here's my solution. Do an MD identity server for host. Right, and then you can do .NET new, and then you see the templates I have installed on this machine, and then I can do .NET new IS4, which is the basic template. Okay, and now I have some files in my local directory, and then I can do add existing project. I have a typo. Oh. Right, and here it is. Okay, let's restore all the packages. So basically now you see that is the new program CS in ASP.NET Core. It's the change from Katana is it's now always self-hosted. There is no IIS hosting anymore in ASP.NET Core. It's always a command line application, and what makes this command line application an ASP.NET Core application, it's because it has this thing called a web host builder, which fires up your application server, so to speak. Yeah, you say like which server you want to use. That's Kestrel. That's the cross-platform server. You specify your working directory. If you run behind IIS, there's special support for that. I think we get to that later as well. And again, there's this thing called startup. Now, startup has three parts typically. The constructor of startup is typically there for setting up your application environment. Yeah, so now this is where you would typically do logging these days, or set up logging. So you set up logging. You know, you can conditionally set up, wire up things based on the hosting environment here. Yeah, so that basically gives you information about like, am I in dev, or am I in staging, or am I in production? So we still use Serilog, yeah, as you can see. That's also quite nifty. You can basically put filters on saying like, you know, if the log entry starts with IdentityServer4, I want to see debug logging, otherwise only warnings, for example. That's quite handy. And then that is now the Serilog adapter for ASP.NET Core logging. Okay, so that was the thing that was missing in Katana, like good support for popular logging frameworks for the Katana built-in logging. And you still have the configure method here. And you see now in our configure method, the only thing we wire up now is just the identity server middleware. That's it. Yeah, the options object is gone for good. The equivalent of the options is now happening in this new method in ASP.NET Core called configure services, and that is where you set up the DI container. So ASP.NET Core now has a built-in DI container. So again, that was code that we could just delete from our code base, which was good. So they call this method first, and then they call the configure method to set up the pipeline. And then here, what you typically do as a syntactic sugar, if you like, you have extension methods for adding the dependencies that Identity Server needs into the DI container. Yeah? They support free primitives, adding singletons, adding transients, and adding scoped dependencies. And what this Identity Server is doing is basically just using the combination of the three to wire up the right services. Another thing I like now is that you can choose now, do you want to run in IIS Express, or do you want to run self-hosted? Okay, I typically prefer self-hosted because that gives me the logging output. Let's actually run it and see what happens. So that's working. We don't have a UI yet. We'll get to that, yeah? So what do we have here? In IdentityServer4, you were forced to use X509 certificates for signing your tokens. That was, by the time, like the most popular choice. As time goes by, more and more people using these protocols, they go away from X509 certificates because of the operational overhead around them, yeah, and the complication, and just use raw RSA keys. So if you want to do that, you can do that now. We have a method called add signing credential, and you can see basically you can pass in an RSA key here. You can pass in a signing credential, which is a .NET type. You can pass in an X509 certificate still if you want that. Or what is the most typical thing for production is that you just pass in the name of a certificate from the certificate store so that your admins can deploy the certificates like, you know, via a portal, for example, and your application just references it by name. Okay, this way the developer doesn't need to deal with these keys. This way they never get checked into source control and so on, or on GitHub, right? We also got a lot of feedback saying like, yeah, all this certificate stuff, you know, I just want to get started. Can't you help me with that? So we have this new method here called the add developer signing credential. Yeah, and this was heavily inspired by the name of this middleware from Microsoft called the use developer exception page, right? And it's called use developer exception page because it's not called use production exception page. Yeah, or use customer exception page or something like that. Yeah, it's basically the new yellow screen of death, which is now white. So what add developer signing credential does is it creates a temporary key, this guy here, temp-key.rsa, and stores it on your file system, right? So now you have a stable key material that you can just work with at dev time, and when you are going to production, you exchange that with a real key material deployed to your production server. Yeah? So yeah, it's not called use production signing key for a reason. Okay? So that's that. What else did we get here? So one of the biggest changes maybe we did in 3 to 4. So when I opened the config of 3, here's the config. So we had clients here, you know, clients, that hasn't changed. These are the clients that interact with the server. You need to register them, you know, configure how they can talk to the server, which resources they can access, and so on. And we had this concept called scopes. Yeah? So it turns out every time I was talking to a customer, it was easy to explain what a user is, it was easy to explain what a client is, but it was very hard to explain what a scope is. Now, so scope is the actual term used in the specification, and what a scope is really is it's a resource that a client application wants to get access to. And unfortunately a little bit, yeah, the OpenID Connect guys kind of overloaded the term scope a little bit, yeah. So a resource can be an identity resource, like your first name, last name, email address, or it can be an API that you want to access. Yeah, so in the OpenID Connect world, identity is a resource the client wants to get access to. So thinking about it, yeah, whenever I explain the term scope, I said like, think of a scope as a resource. And then I thought like, maybe we should rename it to resource and not call it scope anymore. Yeah. So that's actually what we did. Yeah. So in the old world, we had a class called scope, and based on the type property, it was either an identity scope or an API scope or a resource scope. Yeah. So we changed that. Now in the new config, we actually have a thing called API resource, because that's actually what you're modeling, right? You're modeling APIs in your system and you're modeling identity data. So why not have, you know, 2 classes for that? Okay, so how do we merge or convert that? So let's have a look at our client. So that's our console client. Let's copy this guy over and see if it still works. Like this. It almost does, right? Flow seems to be gone. Yeah, so flow is another term from the spec and describes kind of how the client interacts with the server. Yeah? And when we started implementing OpenID Connect, we learned that some of the flows that they specify are incompatible with each other. Like, let's say you're allowing implicit flow and code flow. Where code flow is the more secure one and implicit flow is the less secure one, because in implicit flow the access tokens are transported via the browser. But if you allow both for the same client, all a user needs to do is basically change a parameter in the URL to downgrade from the more secure flow to the less secure flow. So that's why we said, okay, you know what, play it safe, only allow 1 flow per client. Yeah, so then nothing can go wrong. It turns out there are actually valid situations where more than 1 flow is actually really useful for a client. So what we did now is, It's now called allowed grant types. And we have a grant types type here. And we list all the things that we think are useful to be used together. Yeah? So in that case, client credentials. If you want to go completely free form, you can do list and just pass in the grant types you want. We still do validation on that to make sure you're not using a combination of the vulnerable, dangerous grant types, but now you can basically freely combine them, which is good. Because that there were many situations where people were forced to register 2 clients just to achieve logically one operation. So what else has changed? Here's our API resource now. That's the API resource. You give your API a name. I think it's called API here. So that's what we have access to. You can give your API a display name that is useful for logging, for example. This is also useful if you want to show a consent screen and you need some, user-friendly words. The last parameter is basically whenever a client application asks for a resource called API, which claims for the user should go into the access token. Okay, so it's pretty much simplified. So that is the 90% use case. You have an API, you want to register it, you give it a name, you give it a display name, and you specify which claims should go into the access token when a client application asks for it. There are more options here. You can, if you want to make it more complicated, you can still have an API which has multiple scopes, for example. All that is supported, but that is, as I said, the most common use case, and that's what we made very easy now to configure. Okay. So what we have now is our console client that is configured for client credentials. It has a secret. It has access to API, to the API, and we have the API. So in other words, let's run the server and run our API host if it's not running anymore. Actually, I should kill IIS Express for a second because the API probably has the metadata cached. Okay. And I run my console client, and it still works as before. So, in other words, that was what I want to show, that you have 0 code changes in your applications by migrating to the new version. A couple of things around clients here. So we got a lot of feedback that not every client needs a secret. Yeah, so there actually the spec talks about a thing called public clients. So, the OAuth spec has 2 types of clients. One are called confidential clients and one are called public clients. Confidential clients are clients that can keep a secret, or in other words, can securely store a secret, typically something on your server, right? In a data center, you have some way to store the client secret securely. If it's a client application, like something you install on a phone, for example, or deploy to some location but you don't have control over, then there is no way that this client application can store a secret. Yeah. So again, as a security guy, I said well, if we have the option to have a secret, so why not enforce them to have a secret? Yeah. But actually, thinking about it, we forced everybody to deal with secrets, even if they are not secret. Yeah. So we got a lot of pushback, basically. So now what's a new feature actually is you can say require client secret equals false. So that was like on one of the top requests we had. Yeah. The other feature that where people were asking about is, so in my client here in program CS, not the wrong, or not the program CS I'm looking for. Here one. You see, when I request the token, I have to pass in a scope. Again, in version 3, the scope parameter was mandatory, but the spec says it's optional. And again, we just decided that we want to make it mandatory. Again, feedback from people that were using that is, especially for server-to-server style communication, whenever you add a new API to the system, you have to reconfigure identity server and reconfigure the client to know about this new API resource. Yeah? So what we did basically is now, if you don't specify the scope, then what the client will get is an access token for all scopes he has access to automatically. Right? It is especially for server-to-server style communication, makes it much more easier to manage. Okay, so if I run that client now, should close this guy. This will still work even if there is no scope specified, which means you get this whatever scopes you have access to, and that's that. Okay. Let's see. Let's clean up a little bit. What else do we have? Let's have a look at the MVC app now, the MVC client. Yeah, so let's copy over the MVC client as well. Let's go here. Like this. So the MVC client configuration is a bit more because there are more things involved here. Again, same thing. The flow is gone, right? It's now called allowed grant types. Allowed grant types is grant types.hybrid. You can still specify if consent is required or not. You specify the redirect URI. You specify the URI to go to after you log out, to go back. You specify the logout URI for federated sign out. Secret is the same. Allowed scopes is the same concept as well. So now there are two more scopes here we haven't configured yet, and these are so-called identity resources, right? So the OpenID scope maps to the user's unique identifier, whereas the profile scope maps to whatever you think is a relevant part of the user's identity data in a profile. So the way they were configured or defined in the old world was basically by creating a scope, setting this scope to an identity scope, yeah, and then specify these things called scope claims. Yeah? And then you specify basically whenever somebody asks for a profile, create an identity token which has the name, email, and location claims. So let's do the same here in this world. So let's actually do a public static enumerable identity resource get IDs, return new, and since the OpenID scope is so to speak built in, right? It's specified by the spec, so we have that obviously built in. Let's do a new identity resource. Let's see how that looks like. Give it a name, profile. Give it a display name, yeah, your profile data, for example, and then same idea. You just give us the claims that you want to be included, or the claim types rather, that you want to be included when somebody asks for this this token. So it was name, location, and email, I think. Okay, and then that's basically it. Yeah, there are many more options here if you go through the properties of the classes, but again, we thought that is like the 90% use case. You define the name of the identity resource, you give it the claims that should be included, and that's it. So how do we make this available to the server? We go to startup here and add in memory identity resources. Config.get identity resources. Also, what hasn't changed at all, just in case you're wondering, this is the in-memory version is just the built-in one, right? Which makes it easy to get started and to test, for example. But there are also other versions of that which can connect to databases. Now, what we need now to authenticate users are two things. Well, users, yeah, and a UI. And I said like that the UI was the biggest pain point, so to speak, in in IdentityServer4. So we made a choice to decouple the server from the UI. And let me show you a picture from our documentation. So the way we think about it is now this, yeah? You are building an ASP.NET Core application that only has, you know, the typical course of events is you have an application where all of this authentication logic is embedded into that one application, right? You have an account controller where your local passwords and your external accounts and whatever. And then when you're building the second application, obviously you want to share that logic between the applications. So our recommendation is to just take that account controller, so to speak, out of the business application and put it into a separate application, okay? Using your favorite UI framework and all the bells and whistles and everything you have, yeah? And then it is just a standalone ASP.NET Core application containing your login UI or your logout UI, yeah, or your consent UI. So, and then to make this standalone application be reachable, so to speak, via standard protocols, you just put in our middleware, and then we handle the protocol-related endpoints to that. Okay, so that's the way we think about it. So actually, what happens is when the client, now the MVC client, redirects to the protocol endpoint, we just forward that to whatever you configured as being the login page in your application, and then you go back to us, and I'll show that in a second how that works. To get started with the UI, again, a couple of options here. One is we have a repo that is called the Quick Start UI, and this has basically only the UI bits, yeah, your login page, your logout page, your consent screen, and so on, and it's using MVC, standard MVC. So we deleted our view engine, you know, didn't look back, and now you can use whatever UI framework is available to you in ASP.NET Core. Right now, that is only MVC, right? But you know, there are more to come. Like the Nancy guys are working on a ASP.NET Core version, and so on. So you can use whatever is your favorite technology, basically, yeah. And when you download this repo, you will just get controllers, views, and CSS. Or another way to add the UI is by using the template. So we can do .NET new IS4 UI, and that just pulls in the UI bits into your application, and now you can see we have quick starts and views and root, and that has all the UI parts. Yeah, so we are using MVC, so I should add that to my application. So that's Microsoft ASP.NET Core.mvc. Okay. And static files. Not this one, this one. Okay, and when we have that, we can do app.use static files and app.use MVC with default route. And we all love the new Visual Studio, right? It compiles, right? It did compile. I didn't say it runs. And I'm missing this here. Services.add MVC. Yeah, you know, the Visual Studio has this new feature in 2017 called self-healing. So whenever you encounter such a condition, just close it and restart it again, and the problems will be gone. Yeah. We don't need to do that now, but you know, or maybe we do, but not now. Anyways, yeah. So now I have MVC support, I have static files, I have a UI, which means if I run that now, we have a UI. Okay, so we have a UI here. We have /account/login. Here's the login page, right? So the last thing we're missing actually is users. Yeah, and in IdentityServer4 we had this thing called in-memory users. And again, we thought it's completely obvious this is only for testing. But then we got a lot of weird questions like saying like, okay, so how do I load the database table of my users into your in-memory user class? And I thought like, maybe you misunderstood something here, yeah? So we went a lot back and forth, like removing the class, putting it into a separate assembly, putting it into the test project to make it clear it's for testing. And we brought it back in the end, and we renamed it, so I hope this time it's a bit more obvious. It's called test user now. Okay? So, and you know, again, the idea is that with this class, you can substitute for a real database. Yeah, so when you want to get started and want to log in, and also for integration testing, for example, or in-memory hosting, this is very handy to have. Yeah? So, but yeah, they are not for production. Maybe we should have called them developer users. I don't know. So yeah, the last thing we do now is we say add test users. Test users dot users. Cool. So now we have a running IdentityServer. We have a UI. We have users. So let's start our API and start the MVC client. Yeah. Okay, go to secure. That seems to work. We have a login page. Login with Bob. Login with Bob. Right? So that works. We get back the same claims as we've seen before for Bob. And now we can call an API, and that's all working unchanged. Okay? So the last thing we need to migrate over is our Google login. So our old IdentityServer had a button like a login with Google. So actually, before we do that, let me quickly show you how the login page looks like now. So, as I said, yeah, in this picture I've shown you here, basically the client hits the protocol endpoint, and we forward the client to the login page. And the login page defaults to /account/login, right? Because that's just such a common thing to do in MVC. So what your job on the login page is now is, you know, or rather on the account controller, is, well, to show whatever login UI you need. Lovely. To show whatever login UI you need, yeah, to get the job done. So we give you a little helper here. Again, this is now available via the DI system in ASP.NET Core. It's called the IdentityServer Interaction Service. Yeah, maybe on your login UI you need more contextual information about the current authentication request. So to customize the UI on the fly, like maybe you want to change the language on the fly, right? There's a parameter in OpenID Connect that allows you to pass in the UI locale. So maybe you want to change the language. We have other people using it like as a white label solution, where basically based on the client ID, you want to change the styling of the login page, so it looks like, you know, like this is shared between multiple companies. So you can do that as well. Yeah. So basically on that interface, there is a method called getAuthorizationContext, and this returns an authorization context object, and here you get all the contextual stuff. And if you pass custom parameters to the login page, you will get them here as well. Now that was another big thing that people asked for. So, and then you build a login view model, right? So a couple of things you might want to do in a login view model. Let's go to the view to make that clear. Login CSHTML. You see, maybe you don't want to allow name and password, so you don't render that part. Maybe you don't want to allow the remember me checkbox, yeah, then you don't render this part. And if you have external authentication methods, by default, we render them as buttons like login with Google, login with Facebook, and so on. And again, this is all just sample code, really, right? I mean, that is your starting point, and then you can just modify whatever you want. When we come back from the login page, like we post back name and password, then you need to go to your database, not to our test user database, to your database and validate the name and the password. And if that's all fine, you basically just use the standard ASP.NET Core sign-in method to sign in the user into this application. Okay. Another thing we give you here is the so-called return URL. And when you look back at this picture here, the return URL to the login page points back to the authorized endpoint. Yeah. So when you are done with whatever work you're doing, like we pass control over to you, you do whatever you want. It can be arbitrarily complex. When you are done, you are signing in the user with the sign-in method here. And then we give you a helper again to make sure that the return URL that you currently have is actually a valid OpenID Connect return URL back to the authorized endpoint, and no one has changed or played around with it. And if that's fine, you redirect back. So we take over again, and then from there we just return the tokens back to the client application. So we thought that is the best separation of concerns between protocol work and whatever is custom to your scenario. So let's actually add Google now. I have at this point not much confidence in this Visual Studio anymore. Let's see. Authentication. There's the Google middleware. Let's accept that. Okay, now let's go to startup. So let's see. App.use Google. No. So now watch the self-healing. Techorama. Okay, don't touch anything. It needs a second to, Yay! Okay, so what do we need to configure? In ASP.NET Core, every middleware needs a so-called authentication scheme. So we set this to Google. We need a client ID that's coming from Google, and we need a client secret. And we are using this pattern in ASP.NET Core, where basically once you do external authentication, the result of that gets put into a temporary cookie, and then we can hand control back to you. So basically now you can look at the external identity before you sign in the local user, so you can do your claims mapping and claims transformation and so on. And we give you a middleware for that, and you need to know the name, and we have a constant for that because I don't remember that either. Constants.external cookie authentication scheme. Okay. Oh yeah, and where do we get the client ID and the client secret from? From here. So we steal that from here. Start up this guy and this guy. Okay, so now on the account controller you can see when we are building the view model here, there's a method in ASP.NET Core that you can call. It's called authentication.getAuthentication schemes, and that allows you to query the currently configured external authentication methods for this application, and now we can use that information that's coming back here to dynamically change the login page. Okay. So when we run that, and we run the MVC application, go to secure, we now have the login with Google button here. So if I click that, I'm going to Google, and this works as well. Okay. The last thing we only have 4 minutes left. The last thing that many people asked about is Windows authentication. So, like, we have the scenario where some people, some users are external, some users are employees. So can you do Windows authentication at the same time as you do Google or whatever? And this was really tricky in Katana because it was always tricky in .NET because Windows authentication is not handled by .NET, it's handled by IIS, right? So, and nothing has changed here, yeah? So if you want to do Windows authentication, you need a web server that supports it, yeah? And what we can do is now, when we switch to IIS, actually, IIS Express for our host, and actually go to here and go to our settings, we can now turn on Windows authentication for our web server. And now comes the trick. This alone wouldn't be good enough. So I mentioned earlier that you get this line of code here by default, use IIS integration. And what this is actually doing, it kind of smuggles under the cover an authentication middleware into your pipeline for Windows authentication. Okay? So you need to know basically the name of this middleware. It's called Negotiate or NTLM. People that went through this pain know what I'm talking about. And now it's just available as a standard authentication method when you call get authentication schemes. So that's an internal server error. That's not good. Wow. What's your problem? Restart Visual Studio. Let's see. Try it again. Huh. Restart the server. Right, and now we do MVC client. And just by the magic of having both the IIS integration and having Windows turned on, we now have Windows here as well. Okay, and if I click that, I'm logged in, as you see, with my Windows account. Okay, so that's quite nice. This enables a lot of scenarios where basically, for internal users, you directly forward them to the Windows provider. For external users, you show them the login page where they can choose the authentication method they want to use. So there's much more to show actually, but I think that's it for an hour. We think that this version is the best version, the best token service we have built so far, and that there have been a couple already. So it runs on ASP.NET Core. That's probably very important information because there's a lot of confusion here. It runs on ASP.NET Core, but that doesn't mean it needs to run on .NET Core. Actually, most of the people I know, they use ASP.NET Core on top of .NET 4.6 or 4.5.2 or whatever. So, if you get pushback, someone says like, we are not ready yet to move to .NET Core, that's not a requirement. Yeah? Okay, I guess that's it. Thank you for your time and enjoy. Thank you.